Hey guys, today we're talking about storing data locally. In iOS, we're going to use CoreData, and on Android, we're going to use a content provider. So there's a lot of code involved with this, so instead of typing it all out step by step, I'm just going to sort of show you an overall summary. So if you've been following along with this project, what we've done so far is get some JSON data from the internet, and then we've displayed it in a table view. So a question you might have is, what if the user goes offline and still wants to see this data? How can we save it so that next time, if there's no internet access, we can still access this data? So what we're going to do is, you can see in my view to load, we've added some conditions here. So I have this function that checks if the user is connected to the internet. If they are, we're just going to get the posts as usual from the internet. Otherwise, we're going to actually go to the local database and get the posts that are saved there and display that. So we won't need internet access to get those. So this takes a little bit of work to get set up. Obviously, I'm showing you the iOS version right now. We're going to do the same kind of thing in Android. But in iOS, the way to do this is using CoreData. Actually, CoreData is a framework that really simplifies storing data to the disk locally. So the way we're going to do this, first, in order to use CoreData, you need to go to your app delegate, and first you'll have to import the CoreData library and add this code. One is instantiating a persistent container, which is basically where all the data is stored, and another is here a function that actually saves the data when you want to save it. So once you have that set up, you'll need a database model. So the way you can do that is go to New File, go down, and Data Model here. So I already have one right here. And whatever you name that, you need it to be the same name in your app delegate right here. So Data Model is what I called it. And you're going to want to set up an entity. You'll add an entity called post. For this project, all we have is one type of data. It's a post that contains a body, an ID, a title, and user ID. The body is a string, ID is an integer, title is a string, and user ID is an integer. So you make sure the type lines up with whatever you're expecting. So once you have this set up in your data model, you're going to want to be able to represent this model in code. And there's actually a handy way of doing that. You go to Editor, and you'll create an NSManageObject subclass. And what this will do is create these two files. And you can see that this looks a lot like a struct or a class, where you got your properties. You've got a function here that defines what a fetch request is to actually get data of this type from your database. So now you'll have this to work with, just like it would with a class or a struct. So let's get into how to actually save the data once we receive it. So we'll go to our networking client. And you see here, what's going to happen when we receive the data is we're going to go to did receive posts on our post view controller. And here I've added this function. It's going to save and return the post. So before it displays this data, it's going to save it to the disk. So let's see how that function works, save and return posts, which I set up in my database client here. So what this function does is, first it deletes all the posts that are already in the database. So let's see here, that's down here. So this will simply just delete all the posts that are in the database. And if it successfully deletes all the posts, then we're going to go ahead and save the new posts. And this class function is important. Let me go over that. So this actually gets the context from our app delegate. So the context is like this place where you can manipulate the data that is in your database. And then once you're happy with how it is, you are going to go ahead and save the context. So we're first getting a context, then we're defining the entity, so it's a post entity, and we're working with it in the context, the NSManageObject context that we defined up here. Then we're going to create NSManageObjects from the post structs and insert them into our context. So we'll have this array of posts that are all NSManageObjects, And once we successfully do that, we will save it, and it actually saves it to the disk, and we'll return them, because in my post view controller, that's actually expecting us to assign this variable up here to the return value over here. So then we'll have the data that's actually saved match up with the data that we're displaying. So I'm going to go ahead and run it. I've never run it on this device, so you see I've turned off Wi-Fi. So when it hits here, it's not going to have connectivity, so it's going to go here and attempt to get it from the database, but there won't be any data in the database. Since there's nothing in the database, this returns nil, but that's okay because our table view is able to handle when this posts array is nil. So let's turn Wi-Fi back on. We will rerun this. It should get our data, which it did. Alright, Wi-Fi is on. So now the data is saved to the database. So theoretically, if we turn Wi-Fi off, run it again, it'll execute here and there will be data in the database this time. So it'll get the post from there and we'll have it to view even offline. So there it is. We have no Wi-Fi, but we're still seeing these posts that were saved. So that's just a brief explanation of how to use CoreData to save data to the disk. So we're going to do the same thing in Android. You can see in the main activity, you have that similar setup. If we have internet access, we're going to get the posts from the internet. Otherwise, we're going to go to our database and get the posts from there. So instead of CoreData in iOS, with Android, we are going to use what's called a content provider. And in order to get this database set up and be able to save and retrieve data from it, we need to have a few things. So number one is this contract. And this contract basically is going to give a post entry, a URI, and it's going to specify the table and column headers that will be used for a post. You can see it'll be a table called posts, makes sense. And then we have each of our four properties of a post. And we're also going to have this thing called a DB helper. And this isn't really necessary to have a separate file for, but it's a good way of organizing it. So this actually, creates the post table and specifies what kind of data is going to go in each column. And then we have the content provider. You can see this post provider extends content provider. And this is what handles all of the actions like bulk insert, querying, deleting. So retrieving and saving data to and from the database is what the content provider is for. So just like in our iOS project, I have a database client and I have a get posts async task. So it's interesting, in Android you actually have to run queries against your local database in an async task. You can't do it synchronously. So we have that set up here. We also have our save posts function, similar to our save and return posts in iOS. But this takes a content values array, and you're able to then get your content provider using this get content resolver method, and you can just bulk insert a content values array, and that will save the data to your database. So we're actually going to call this save post function from our networking client. So you see here, before we send the data back to the main activity, we're going to save it. And back to the main activity, I already showed you this, but it's very similar. It's going to check to see if we have internet access, and then if it does, get the posts. Otherwise, it's going to get the posts from the database. And then every time we do have internet access, it's going to save those posts so we can retrieve them later. So let me run it. So you can see, since I have run it on this device before, it was able to get the data from the database. So which one's better? Well, just because I really don't like the whole NS manage object concept, I'm going to say Android's content provider framework is better. And if you want to check out either of these projects, I'll put links to them on GitHub in the description. Thanks for watching.